Thank you so much for inviting me to talk. I'm going to talk on behalf of our Aquafol. We have an interesting product, but I'm going to tell you some of the story of why this product is so important, especially for autism. I'm Dr. Fry. I have a number of different places at the Autism Discovery and Treatment Foundation, Southwestern Autism Resource Center, and the Rossignol Medical Center. So, just to make clear, we're going to talk a little bit about clinical trials and some treatments for autism. These are not FDA approved, so this is mostly either in off-label or in clinical trial studies. So one of the things that we know, I think that probably preaching to the choir here, is that the autism prevalence has increased dramatically. This is a really nice, I think, graphic from Taka showing that since 2000, it's really increased 178%. And since that time, so I think the important thing is to realize, these numbers come from the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network run by the CDC, which has been ongoing for 20 years. And in those 20 years, we've watched the evidence, the prevalence increase. The average age of diagnoses has not dropped, and it's still at about 4.5 years of age. And there are no really effective treatments for autism, especially for core abnormalities. So what I'll talk about is what we found in treatment of problems in folate metabolism in children with autism, and how we can correct that with a special type of folate. Folate is an extremely important vitamin. We always know how important it is, especially during pregnancy. Folate is really essential for many reasons, and here we have folate pathway and the important areas that it goes into. What's really important, I think, that people don't realize, and why it's so important that we use reduced folates in autism, is that when we mostly think about what we get from the diet, what our food is fortified with, is folic acid. And folic acid is the oxidized synthetic form of folate. It's very inexpensive, so we can fortify our food with it. But in order for the body to use it, the body has to reduce folic acid into a reduced form of folate. And we can see the pathway here, where it has to go through dihydrofolate reductase. And one of the things that we're learning is that unmetabolized folic acid does build up in the body and actually can inhibit folate metabolism at high levels. And this is not true of the bioavailable folates, like 류코보린을 acid and 5-tetrahydrofolate, which can readily go into the folate cycles and be metabolized. Folate, very important, two of the major metabolic pathways that's attached to the folate cycle. You can see on the left there that we make purines. Purines are very important because they make some of the precursors for important other metabolic pathways. That is ATP, which is important in the mitochondria as our energy molecule. GTP, which is the precursor to something called tetrahydrobiopterin, which is a cofactor for making all our monoamine neurotransmitters, serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which we know is dysregulated in individuals with autism. Nitric oxide production, which also we know is dysregulated in autism, and phenylalanine metabolism. And of course, those are the precursors to RNA and DNA, which are important when cells are proliferating, but also in the normal maintenance of cells and repair of the genetic code. On the other side of the folate cycle is attached to methylation metabolism. Of course, methylation is important for making for epigenetics, so that we can regulate turning on and off genes and enzymes, which is very important for regulating metabolism and development, and is attached to redox metabolism for creating glutathione. Folate is also essential for mitochondrial function, including helping making many of the precursors that are important for electron transport chain and other important metabolic pathways in the mitochondria. Folate has a very complex metabolism. After it's absorbed through the gut, it's activated to its bioavailable form in the liver, and then it's transported to many important parts of the body. And two of the important parts we're going to talk about today really is the brain, where it's transported into the nervous system through special transporters, and also transported across the placenta during pregnancy. The brain, as we know, is a very important place. That's where all our thinking happens. Our neurons are activated. But in order for our brain to work, of course, it needs all its nutrients and cofactors. Almost everything that gets into the brain can't get in there just by diffusing into the brain. That is, the brain is a protected area of the body, and molecules have to actually be transported from the blood into the brain. And the two major ways, the places that it's transported is through the blood-brain barrier and also the blood-CSF barrier. And we have special transporters that actually transport molecules from the blood into the CSF or into the astrocytes. One of the important transport mechanisms we'll talk about today is a transporter folate. So folate needs to be transported into the brain with the folate receptor alpha or the reduced folate carrier. And we can see here that these two mechanisms transport folate from the blood across the choroid plexus epithelial cells into the CSF. Now there's these two transporters, but the folate receptor alpha is the most important. And that's because you can see it's kind of large there on the diagram because it has a high affinity for folate. So folate binds onto it and it's actively transported across the cell into the CSF where it's then in the brain. Now the levels of folate in the brain are actually about 2 to 3 higher than in the blood. So this is a very active transport mechanism to actually transport folate through an uphill gradient. The reduced folate carrier is the alternative way of getting folate into the brain, but it doesn't have the same affinity for folate as the folate receptor alpha. So about 15, almost 20 years ago now, Dr. Rainmakers in Belgium discovered that there were some children that had developmental delay with no explanation. He found that these children had low levels of folate in the CSF when he did lumbar punctures on them. And he didn't exactly know why. First thing he thought is maybe there was some type of genetic disorder in the folate receptor alpha gene, and he sequenced those genes, and he found that there wasn't, that none of them had genetic disorders. So he teamed up with Dr. Quatros at SUNY Downstate, and what Dr. Quatros found is that this folate receptor alpha, there was an autoantibody in the blood of these children that were preventing the folate transporter from working and transporting folate in the brain. So levels of folate in the blood were absolutely normal. And this case series was published, it's really the landmark paper, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. These children had certain characteristics, particularly when they were first described. They seemed to have neurologic deficits that had an onset about a little before a year old with neurodevelopmental delay, and some of them neurodevelopmental regression. Many of them had dyskinesias and movement disorder, and epilepsy and seizures would develop, and if they weren't treated, they could have visual disturbances, blindness, and hearing loss. In this study, they showed that the titers of these antibodies that they had discovered were much higher in these patients with cerebral folate deficiency than control subjects. And so Dr. Quatros identified two antibodies, one called a blocking antibody and one called a binding antibody. The binding antibody bound to the folate receptor alpha, which you can see on the bottom here, and interfered with its ability to function. And the blocking antibody blocked the area on the receptor where folate would bind. So folate was not able to actually bind to the folate receptor alpha. And so folate cannot be transported into the brain using this mechanism. Luckily, we have this backup mechanism, the reduced folate carrier, that we can use, and we can kind of push folate through the choroid plexus epithelial cells by giving special types of folate, reduced folate, and giving it at high doses. That is, remember, the concentration of folate in the brain is much higher than it is in the blood. So in order to essentially push folate through the reduced folate carrier, the high levels in the blood higher than normal. Some of the data actually have verified that that blocking antibody actually was stopping folate from getting into the brain. Two studies have actually shown that there's a correlation between the titers of the blocking antibody and the folate levels in the brain. A study that came out after that started to describe other characteristics of these children with cerebral folate deficiency and their response to treatment. And you can see that if they started treatment early, some of the defects, particularly neurologic defects like ataxia, criminal defects, and dyskinesias may improve in a majority of them. However, other symptoms would not. And one of the symptoms that started to become very apparent is that these children had characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. So when this came out, so there was evidence that these children with cerebral folate deficiency may have symptoms of autism. Myself and my colleague, Dr. Rosignol, asked, well, we have a whole clinic of kids with autism. How many of these kids with autism may have cerebral folate deficiency? And so we looked at whether they had these antibodies that block the ability of folate to get into the brain. And we actually found in our clinic, in the first 93 patients that we published, that about 60% of them had the blocking antibody, and 50% of them had the binding antibody. Or about 75% of them had one of those two antibodies. So 75% of the children with autism had antibodies that prevented folate from getting into the brain, or at least reduced it. So the next step was, do these kids respond to treatment if you treat them with a reduced folate? So we treated them with folinic acid, also known as leucovorin, at 2 milligrams per kilogram per day. And one of the reasons why leucovorin was we thought so helpful, or was the kind of treatment of choice, is leucovorin, as many of you probably know, has been used in oncology for decades. So we knew the safety profile of it, and we knew the dosing of it. And we found that the children that had these antibodies in autism, if we treated them with leucovorin at 2 milligrams per kilogram per day, that they had a significant improvement in receptive language, expressive language, verbal communication, stereotype behavior, and attention. And on average, they were being treated for about 4 months. When we looked at the response rate, we found that about 66, or about 2/3 of the children, had improvements in receptive language, expressive language, and verbal communication. Of course, this was an open label study, so the next step would be to go to a double-blind placebo-controlled study. And then in 2018, we published this paper, which was the results of our double-blind placebo-controlled trial. This was published in Molecular Psychiatry, first at 2016 online and 2018 in print, where we looked at verbal communication. So one of the things that we keyed in on is that language was one of the things, at least, that was most obviously improving. And language is really important because language you actually can measure quantitatively by an objective observer. One of the problems that we've seen in many trials clinical trials of kids with autism is that the outcome measures are usually parent-reported measures, which are very open to bias and placebo effect, and many trials have failed because of that. So we actually designed an algorithm to find the most ability-appropriate language measure, to measure their language ability, and follow them over 12 weeks of treatment. And about half received leucovorin, half received placebo. And what we found in 12 weeks, there was a significant improvement in verbal communication. And also the other thing we looked at is we looked at some of the side effects of leucovorin. So a lot of people talk about leucovorin and folates and how they can make kids hyper-excitable. So we actually looked at the side effects of leucovorin and found that that excitability on this medication was almost, the first 6 weeks of treatment was indistinguishable really than placebo. But that at 9 weeks, actually excitement and hyperactivity plummeted and was significantly better at the end of the trial at 12 weeks. One of the questions we had in this trial, we took all comers, those that were positive and those that were negative for the folate autoantibody. So we asked if the folate autoantibody can predict, as we would hypothesize, it being the biological mechanism, could predict if the child would respond to leucovorin. And indeed, it did. And we can see that the children with autism that had the folate autoantibody positive, the effect size was very large at 0.91. And we were able to actually calculate, since we're looking at language, we were able to calculate how much change in language was occurring in the children that were just getting speech therapy and on placebo versus, what that change was equivalent to the change that was seen with leucovorin. We were able to calculate that those children that were positive for the antibody and treated with leucovorin, in those 3 months it is essentially equivalent to 177 hours of speech therapy. So most children get 1 hour of speech therapy a year, a week. So that's essentially equivalent to 3 years of speech therapy, or if you calculate how much, about $7,000. So the cost of leucovorin is about $300 for those 3 months. So you can calculate the significant savings that you have. And of course, it's important because if you advance language in children earlier on, not only do you save the cost of speech therapy, but they're going to be higher functioning, they'll be able to communicate more, and they usually have less behaviors. And so here is a really great video of a child with cerebral folate deficiency that was treated with leucovorin. This is a really incredible case. This is a child with Down syndrome who at about 3 years old regressed and went from not being able to speak or not being able to walk, which you'll see. It was identified that he had cerebral folate deficiency and some mitochondrial dysfunction. And with treatment with leucovorin and some mitochondrial supplements, he made a tremendous change. And this is really such a striking video, I thought I would have to show it to you guys.
That's really good, Reedy. Say ball.
Whoa!
Say
Yeah.
purple.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
All right, one of the other things that we're starting to realize is that this same transport mechanism is not just on the blood-brain barrier, but it's also on the maternal placenta interface. So if the mother has these same antibodies, this may actually prevent folate from getting into the fetus, and so there actually may be a deficit in folate availability before birth, in addition to after birth as a child. To prove this and to look at this further, Dr. Quatros actually developed an animal model, a rat model, where he injected the antibodies into the mother, the pregnant mother. And what he found in one study, which I'm not showing, is that they had these deficits. And then what he did is he treated the mother with either folinic acid, leucovorin, or steroids. And what he showed is that when the babies came out, instead of having these deficits, and we can see on the left number of calls normalizes, and on the right entrance into the shock zone is reduced over time. So you have learning over time if the mother was treated with the folinic acid or leucovorin if they had these antibodies. So this actually maternal model can be rescued. And so this is really important because what we find is that children that have the folate autoantibody, their parents actually have the folate autoantibody also. So in this study done by Dr. Quatros, he looked at the prevalence of the folate autoantibody in the proband, the child with autism, and the mother and father and sibling, which showed that they all have an increased prevalence of having the folate autoantibody versus controls. So this actually seems to be some type of familiar factor that can affect the child and the family. And some data from Dr. Rainmaker's, he actually looked at the response rate to treatment with leucovorin, depending on how many individuals in the family, that is mother, father, or child, were positive for the antibody. And he showed that actually it's not just the child, but it's the mother and father too, and their positivity that, that modulates how well, what the outcome is of the child and the severity of autism. So leucovorin has been around for a long time. What apropos has developed is a new type of leucovorin, levoleucovorin, which is the isomer, the L isomer of leucovorin. It has higher activity, doesn't contain the D form of regular leucovorin. Its dosage can be reduced, so instead of giving 2 milligrams per kilogram, we give 1 milligram per kilogram. We have a device which I'll show you, which allows us to very accurately dose this in a liquid formulation rather than the tablet that we have commercially, so it can be precisely dosed according to the weight. And this is the bottle that it comes in. It's a bottle that actually allows a consistent drop size. It's preservative free, so the bottle is actually designed so that it avoids contamination when the drops come out. So that means that no preservatives have to be used, because we know that children with autism and other developmental disorders are very sensitive to additives and preservatives, and it's very easy to dose through this system. Right now, using this, we have 3 phase 2 trials funded, 2 federally funded, one by the Department of Defense, one by the National Institutes of Health, and then another trial funded by Autism Speaks. In 2 of these trials, so they differ, these trials differ first in the age range. So the NIH trial is a school-age trial. It's similar to our previous trial looking at more school-age children, 5 to 17 years of age. And then the DoD trial and the Autism Speech trial is looking at preschool children, 2.5 to 5, to see if dosing them earlier and treating them earlier, we have improved outcomes. Outcome measures are slightly different. There's one of the school-age trial and one of the preschool trial. Both looks at language and additional biomarkers besides the folate receptor alpha as outcome measures. And the autism speech trial is more taking it to the next step and looking at social interactions and using neuroimaging to see how we're actually normalizing the brain pathways with leucovorin. Right now, given the prevalence of autism and the cost per person, we know is about $80,000 per year. The retail price of this is thought to be probably about $8,000, $9,000 per annum. So that makes a total market potential of about $313 billion for this treatment, given the rates of autism. And of course, the important thing is that improving children and their social function and their language would reduce the number of therapies that they would need and reduce that cost dramatically per annum for individuals with autism, and of course improve quality of life. So I thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions.